Welcome to Women Winning Divorce. I am your host, Heather Quick. I am an attorney, entrepreneur, author, and founder of Florida Women's Law Group, the only divorce firm for women by women. I love thinking big, thinking outside the box, creating creative solutions for women, and empowering women to win in all aspects of their life. Our approach at Florida Women's Law Group is to provide women with a strategy to not only achieve their objectives, but win at life. I believe that what may show up as adversity is simply an opportunity to change and improve your life. In each episode, I sit down with innovative professionals and leaders who are focused on how you can be your best self before, during, and after divorce. In these conversations, we are looking at how women can win at life. I have the unique opportunity to meet women when they are at a transition period of life. But that is only the beginning to becoming your best self and winning at life on your terms. With our guests, we enjoy the opportunity to explore ways all women can win and enhance their life, no matter where they are in their journey. Because divorce is just a point in life, not the end and not what defines you, rather a catalyst for your growth. Welcome to today's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, I'm being joined by Rebecca Palmer, family law attorney and owner of Rebecca L. Palmer Law Group in Orlando, Florida. Rebecca has a wide variety of legal experience, not just in family law, but in insurance and corporate law as well. She is an author and has been an adjunct professor for Emory, UCF, Stetson, Berry College, and Southern College. Rebecca, that's amazing. You are a busy woman.
Thank you, Heather. And I was also in the sandwich generation. I took care of my two elderly parents and raised two kids. So it's been a journey, but Heather, thank you for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we are so thankful to have you and can't wait to talk today during our episode. But first, I'd love if you would share with me and our listeners a little bit about how you got into family law.
Well, it was a journey, no doubt. So to step back to my college days, I wasn't one of those people who grew up wanting to be a lawyer. In fact, I studied abroad, England, Guatemala, Mexico, and I was in England when I took the LSAT, of all places.
Wow.
And I remember calling my parents and I said, hey, look, if I get into law school, I'll go. And I said, if I don't get into law school, whatever money you would have potentially given me, will you give me so I could go be a starving actress in New York? That was my plan B. And then I went and lived with my brother and his wife for a while, and they're both lawyers. And he had good advice. He's like, don't become a lawyer because I'm a lawyer. Don't not become a lawyer because I'm a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And by the way, a law degree is not going to hurt you. Right. And so I went to law school, absolutely fell in love with the law. I was on trial team and I kind of realized, wow, this is like being on the stage, but I'm writing the lines, And so it was a really good experience. Family didn't come right away for me. I worked at larger law firms, some in South Florida, one that was out of New York. And, they didn't really do family law. In fact, warned me against it. One of my mentors was like, do anything but family law. And so at one of the firms, I started dabbling in it and absolutely loved it. My then boyfriend and now husband of 23 years saw it. It just lit a fire in me doing family law. And he was like, why don't you just do it? This is what you love. This is your thing. And so I was writing memos to this large law firm in Central Florida to the president. And I went on maternity leave, over 20 years ago. And they called me up and they said, okay, you can do family law. AK, come back. You can do what you want.
Right.
So I did. And it was a wonderful experience because being in a larger law firm, I had the safety net. I had the stability of corporate law and insurance and other kinds of law. I even dabbled a little bit in real estate. That was not my thing. But family law is. And I've had the pleasure and joy and ride doing family law. I'm sure you might have seen my background. I did everything from the Tiger Woods divorce. I represented Elin, who's lovely, by the way, and to my friends at the gym. So it's right. I've got the gamut of cases, but it's my passion. I absolutely I feel like I am working for individuals, and
Right.
I'm walking a walk with them that is not an easy one. It's pretty complicated and difficult, but I get the pleasure of seeing them at the other side when they're doing okay and they got through it. One of my favorite stories, Heather, is a girlfriend of mine. I did her divorce, and about a year afterwards, I asked she and her daughter out to lunch with me and my daughter and to play. And I'm sitting there having lunch, and I said to her, "Oh my God, I know who you need to meet." She's like, "Oh, what are you talking about?" She says, "I haven't dated. I've been divorced a year. I don't want to date anybody." And I'm like, "Trust me, meet this guy." Happy to say, 3 years after that, I was performing their wedding down in Key West.
Oh my
So
gosh.
when say I get to see the other side, I really get to see the other side.
Well, that is wonderful. And, I do think sometimes, with the many, many guests on our show, and particularly family law lawyers, they say, sometimes family law just chose me and it was what I was meant to do, even though I didn't know it when I first started out in the law.
Bingo.
And I think the most successful family law lawyers and who do the best for their clients just really love it because we really are changing people's lives. We are helping them achieve something that they really cannot get through the process without. And ideally, they have a great future in front of them and it's an opportunity for them to, go a different way and grow
Ag-
and,
Agreed.
really realize their potential.
Agreed 100%, Heather. And, and they really, many of my clients can't see that when they're in the thick of it. And
Yep.
so
It's so
I-
hard. They're in so
it's
much
so hard.
pain and they're so scared. And that is what's great about it is just the change. And sometimes one of my attorneys said that we were in a meeting and she told the client, she goes, "You can't see what I can see." She's like, "I saw you in day one and now here it's end. Like you're a different person. You're
Right.
lighter. You just look like, you're ready to take on the world." And that's just a very fulfilling thing that I think is what you
I
spoke
think
about,
you're
what
a
you get to
hundred
do.
percent right. You're 100% right, Heather. And it really is fulfilling. It was one thing to win something for a insurance company. Well, nothing's wrong with insurance companies. They're
Nothing's wrong.
important,
No, true, true.
but it's a whole nother experience, really walking the walk with somebody who's going through such a tough time. And you literally have to, if you're doing your job right, remind your clients, hey, what do you love doing? Do you love movies? Go
Mhm.
see a movie with a friend tonight. I mean, because they're just hit with a ton of bricks. And even reminding simple things to that, and finding good counselors for your clients, and finding answers. It's like playing chess. You got to figure out financially and regarding children,
Mhm.
what to do. One of my toughest cases I had was an international relocation, and most, as you know, family law cases don't go to long trials. That was a 2-week trial. One
Wow.
entire week on money, one entire week on the children and relocation. It was a lot.
That's a
Um,
lot of issues.
but it taught me, as much as I said early on in our conversation, that the whole litigation thing is something I love. Also taught me when you can settle, do. I'm also a mediator, and I've really learned that, particularly after that trial, because it just was so much. I'm so happy for my client. She and her kids do live in England, even though they were raised here. So it was a, good result for her. But man, it was rough. And on everybody.
Yeah.
Hey, good news was I lost a lot of weight during the trial, so that was a
I
bonus.
bet. Oh, I bet you did. Well, we're so happy to have you today, Rebecca, and I'm excited to talk about an interesting topic that we really haven't touched on a whole lot on the show yet. And it was your idea to talk about domestic partnerships and particularly how younger couples like millennials are choosing to not get legally married, but that this then provides them with the rules with which to, play by, I suppose. Why don't you share with our listeners a little bit about, what is a domestic partnership?
Well, Heather, you're right. This is a new concept,
Mhm.
and it's not necessarily legally defined. But the idea is, hey, we're together. We want a title for who we are.
Right.
We're not boyfriend girlfriend necessarily. What are we? Well, we're in a domestic partnership, And so it mirrors a lot of things of marriage, but it also differs from a lot of things in marriage. And what I mean by that is it mirrors the concept that you can live together, buy a home together, just like, you can buy a home with a friend, it's you
Right.
buy a home. So it's got a lot of that. Speaking of insurance again, there are certain insurance companies it matters that if
Right.
you're in a domestic partnership, your partner can get insurance if you have it. So that's a bonus legally. But it also has a lot of, not, I don't want to say entanglements, that's the wrong word,
Mhm.
but it's not going to mean you get half their 401k like you would in a
Right.
marriage.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there's certain things that you would otherwise be entitled to potentially if you're married, it does not come into play in a domestic partnership.
Now, how does it like right, which is that's one way, like you said, it differs from a traditional marriage, but why how I guess why would people then, if they're saying, well, we don't want the to be legally married, but yet how do we help them understand, well, there might be some reasons you do want to have a domestic partnership agreement. You want to have something because you have no rights as it stands now in your
Right.
relationship, right?
Well, as mentioned earlier, insurance is a big, big, big one.
Hmm.
But on top of that, I mean, we still like to understand what bubble we're in our lives
Right.
and
Yes.
give it some kind of definition. And I think domestic partnership gives a definition for the couple, letting them know, okay, we're committed, we're involved in this. We just don't want to do the, institution of marriage for whatever reason. There's a lot of
Right.
reasons for that.
Hmm.
And, and there, like I said, there can be some downfalls to it. For example, if your domestic partner, if one of the other dies, would not have the same rights
Right.
as if you were
Hmm.
married. Excuse me. So there's that as a
Well, what
true
about
two.
taxes? Can you file taxes together in your
No,
domestic partnership?
it's not progressed that far yet. Maybe in some states, and that's always important to notice, is every state is different.
Right. Right. But not like, guess at least not federal taxes. Um,
Right, right, right. So state and federal different things, but yeah. So no, it's not like you can marry, file married, filing
mhm,
singly or file jointly. That's a good example, Heather, of
right.
something you can't do. Now, maybe that's good. Maybe you don't want to do taxes together.
Right.
Um, but it is, I think, as they say, death and taxes. Um,
Hmm.
that's a big one that is a distinction between marriage and domestic partnership where it's very different.
Now, is there anything that, or what exactly is legally recognized in a domestic partnership?
It depends on the state and what issues you're talking about. You almost have to break it down. For example, let's say it is a man and a woman and they have a child, or maybe it's same-sex marriage and they have a child that they adopt. Um, which opens up a whole nother issue of whether you can or can't, again, depends on the state.
Yeah.
But if you're in a domestic relationship, it's almost like if something happened and you had a child, it'd almost be like a paternity action or a maternity action,
Right. Right.
because there's
Absolutely.
not a marriage there, which big news in Florida. I don't know if you're aware what's happened this month, but we have alleviated permanent periodic alimony, which, eh, you know, is wild. And there's now a presumption of 50-50 with kids. And so those type of things would not apply in a
Hmm.
domestic relationship. Now, not that you couldn't have 50-50, arrangements with the child that you had in a domestic partnership, you can, just like you could in a paternity action. Um, but it's new, Heather. So I think the law has not developed as far as I think it ultimately will
Right.
at this stage, and because it
Now,
is a newer concept.
and do you think that, or could we draw some parallels? Because we know in Florida, well, for our listeners, I think most people have heard the term common law marriage. I get asked that at least once or twice a year. Um, and do you think that it's similar to that, like where some states may then now just instead of calling it a common law marriage, call it a domestic partnership, and you would qualify as that? Or do you think it's something that the states are going to have to adopt, maybe more laws?
I think that's a really interesting question, because you are correct. There is no common law marriage. And I actually had a case where the attorney thought there was, and I'm like, there's not. There's not palimony anymore. There's certain things that don't exist. But I think you hit it on the head, that ultimately I think there's gonna have to be some laws, some guidance for individuals
Right.
who choose that type of a relationship. Because we're 2023, and that's totally different than it was just when I started practicing nearly 30 years ago. I mean, it's night and day. And relationships are, the design of families has changed. So I think it's got to develop still. And I think it is still developing. And I think ultimately there will be some laws and more clear guidelines on it than there is currently.
Now, one of the things, and I have friends and colleagues, all over the country, and we might dip into this a little bit after the break, but I know in other states, and I think this would be completely, you could do this in Florida as well, really like enter into a, say, cohabitation agreement, as far as maybe establish some, so you can enter into a contract that would maybe give you some guidance into, the financial aspect, most likely, of that relationship.
Absolutely, Heather. It's kind of like in Florida, there's no such thing as legal separation. However, you can draft up a legal document about your separation or domestic partnership, and guess what? You got a contract. And so, I would encourage people to think about that. If you've decided not to do a traditional marriage, all right, well, we got to have some understandings and we have to have some ground
Mhm.
rules and understand what's happening here. And just as my dad was a minister, and he always said it should be harder to get married and easier to get a divorce. And I would encourage people thinking about a domestic partnership to put kind of the same thought into it. If you're going to do that, why not sit down and negotiate it, etc. So you have an understanding with one another.
Absolutely. I completely agree, because once you, even if you're just living together and keeping things separate, there's still naturally over time you tend to build assets together. And, there is that usually intersection of the finances as well. And it'd be wise to outline that, just
Agreed, Heather.
because there's nothing legally to protect you, whether you like the laws in Florida or not. When you get married, then those are the laws which will govern your divorce. And so if you break up, particularly after a lot of time and or money, children together, it makes a lot of sense to
No,
have
it really,
that.
it really does. And I just, like in any relationship, let's say an employment relationship. Let me understand, what are my guidelines? What are my expectations? What can I and shouldn't I do as an employee? And, what are my hours? And so there should be a discussion like that. If anyone out there, out of your listeners, are thinking, this is interesting. I've been with so and so for a certain long amount of time. I just don't want to get married, but I do want to take a step.
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly.
and so this is another option. And again, I keep going back to insurance, but that is a big deal, to be able to have insurance, because, we all know insurance is expensive
Mhm.
and for some people hard to obtain. And if the domestic partnership makes that possible, something to look into. But definitely have some understandings with one another of what everything looks like. And because otherwise it gets really, really messy. Not that it wouldn't otherwise, but really, really, really messy if you have no guidelines.
Absolutely. Well, we are going to take a short break, and when we come back, we will continue talking about domestic partnerships and different options. In the meantime, if you are enjoying this show or our other shows previously, we would love for you to leave us a review that will help other listeners find us, and we will be right back. We are back from our break, and again today I am joined by Rebecca Palmer, Florida attorney. And we are discussing what a domestic partnership is and who might elect one over traditional marriage. And Rebecca, you are published on this subject. Can you share with our listeners and me, who are the people entering into domestic partnerships?
A lot of them are millennials, and because it's a new world.
Mhm.
I'm really, really fortunate to have children and watch their ages. And man, they point out stuff and correct me on stuff that just was not something I grew up with. You know, Interestingly enough, Heather, I grew up in the Midwest, and I didn't know anybody divorced till I was in college.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it was just another world.
Mhm.
Now what do we statistics say 50-50? Who knows what the real numbers are of people getting divorced, but it's a new world. And I don't know if we're more open-minded or creative, or we're just evolving
Mhm.
into different designs of how we live our lives.
Well, and I think, it was interesting. We had quite an interesting person on the podcast a few months ago. And she was talking about the origins of marriage, and it was really just it was more financial, but then she was like, when it started, nobody had a very long life expectancy, so nobody really expected to be married very long. And now with this longer life expectancy, I think that's what she was saying. And it all came down to, we were talking about prenups, postnups, similar, like, I mean, really that's, or a domestic partnership agreement or something that where you can kind of write the rules for that, as to how you want that to be. Because, I've had, and it's been a lot of years, but it's certainly not been only one person throughout the years. I've had women come to me, and they weren't married, and she's like, I'm a stay-at-home mom. And you're like, well, like, you're gonna be out of luck, right? Like, you two made this agreement together, but you're not married, and the laws would protect you in, if you're married, because then we have some rules by which to go by when you break up. But in that case, it's just going to be dealing with the children, and you're going to be out financially. And too many women, I just don't, they don't know what they don't know. They just don't, I guess, look that far ahead. I'm not sure, but like, they're giving up, or they're stopping their, contribution to the workforce and their ability to earn money. And yet, if you don't have some kind of agreement with somebody, you're just going to be out of luck.
Right. And it's interesting, women and men alike. You don't know what you don't know. I remember a consult I once had, this is years ago, with a male, the husband, and he goes, I want to be so generous. I want to be so generous to her. And he's like going on and on. I'm listening,
Yeah.
I'm observing and I'm taking in what he's saying. And he goes, I'm going to give her half of everything.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Like, well, that's kind of the law. So, and he
I'd like
almost
the
fell out
bare
of his,
minimum, but
yeah,
okay.
he almost fell out of his chair. He literally thought he was like being so generous because he was the only
Mhm.
one who worked in the marriage. So
Right.
therefore thought it was his. And that's
Hmm.
not the way it works. And so, when I had to break it to him as gently as I could, that's something called equal distribution, and what you've accumulated from the date of marriage till separation or filing of divorce or an agreement on a date. It's 50-50. I mean, not, it's equitable. It's not equal,
Right.
but more or less. And so you don't know what you don't know. And there's so many feelings, and I know your listeners out there probably have a gamut of them about support and alimony, and should it exist, should it not, on both sides. For someone
Right.
who decided not to work, and that was the marriage or relationship, let's call it,
Hmm.
agreement. That's a decision for the couple, but there's consequences to those decisions. And
Right.
I don't know if everybody understands that. And those are evolving consequences.
Hmm.
So if you got married, again, 30 years ago, when I started, I used to say women ruled the roost because they just did,
Right.
particularly when it came to the kids. And they were looking at
Hmm.
alimony. Now we got
Right.
so many different possibilities of what could happen. There's real consequences to these decisions. I think my dad was spot on when he said, it should be harder to get married and easier to get a divorce, so that you come in understanding what the definition of your reality is.
Absolutely. Right. And many times, like, and the thing is, which, and I could appreciate, maybe don't really understand, but I certainly appreciate some people want to just be together. They don't want to be married. They don't believe in, those, whatever the rules, the
That
religion
box,
part of
yeah.
it, or whatever the laws. But with that, there's so much positive that comes out of, being in a relationship and building things together. But, what I wonder is when people are entering into maybe this kind of alternative agreement arrangement, if they're really fully aware of what they lack in legal rights, or do you think they usually understand that this is very different from being married?
No, I don't think they do. I think, I almost, I almost encourage people to, talk to a lawyer, before making a decision. Do we get married? Do we not? I mentioned earlier that I do wedding ceremonies for friends,
Right.
people I'm close to. And I absolutely 100% insist on a sit down meeting or two or three or four, depending on what the issues are, so that they understand consequences of
Mhm.
various actions, marriage, not marriage, those type of things. So I would actually tell your listeners, if you're thinking about this, and it may or may not be relevant. I mean, I laugh because I asked my husband again, 23 years, for us to get a prenup, and he just started giggling. He goes, "We're both lawyers. We both have law school loans." Because what is this really going to look like? I mean, loans were clearly non-marital because they were, you know, incurred at the time before the marriage. So, but sure, could it be overkill? Like my husband kind of laughed and said, "We don't need a prenup." He was
Yeah.
right. We didn't at that stage in our lives,
Mhm.
but doesn't hurt to get advice and
Correct.
and to know what you're getting into. And that sounds really funny, but um, hey, what's wrong with spending an hour of time and a little bit of money on an attorney? Just kind of say, hey, what we're trying to figure out what to do here
Mhm.
with our relationship. So I would encourage people to consider that. I know some religious sects and churches, require those type of meetings, but I really encourage it. So, think about what are we doing? How are we designing our relationship? What do we expect of each other?
Mhm.
And hopefully you can really talk it through. I mean, I was fortunate enough when I had my first child, my husband was like, "You want to work, work. You don't. Think it through." And there's a lot to that comment.
There really is that.
you know,
It seems, and I think we both see that a lot so often, on the back end, because people enter, committed relationship, they take on certain roles,
right,
and ideally they are, benefiting one another, right? Especially when you bring children in. I mean, somebody's got to take care of the
right,
child, and
right. I-
choices get made, whether it's the mother or father may stay home for a period of time or not. But like that in and of itself, just like you said, it has huge implications because,
Absolutely.
just 10 years, and especially today. I mean, because you and I, we finished law school. Well, okay, there was Westfall when I was there, but we still had a lot of books. Like I had to do a lot of book research, and it wasn't
Oh,
nearly
me
what it
too.
is
Oh, me
now. Right.
too.
But now the
High
world is
five.
changing so fast. Can
So
you
fast.
imagine if in the practice of law, right now, we even took 5 years out? How much most likely would change and how much
Oh,
it would take to get caught back up?
absolutely. Absolutely. And I
And
watched that with some of my clients who've been out of the
mhm,
workforce and want to get back in. And sometimes it works out, but it can be a huge challenge. And it's a
yeah,
very personal decision whether you work or not. And I'm not judging
yeah,
anybody. My mom happened to be one of the only moms I knew who worked. Not only did she work and have four kids, she went back and got her PhD after having four kids.
Wow.
I always laugh, remember back in the day of Girl Scouts, etc.
Yes.
Girl Scouts, I go to all these meetings with everybody's moms, and we're making cookies and doing arts and crafts. What does my mom do? Take us to her office. And I don't know what we were doing. We're stapling stuff, and we're like,
There had to be some kind of badge that
I
you guys
just-
absolutely should have gotten for that.
that was her activity for
Right.
the troop, was to go to work. And so it's just a different decision, and it's a tough one. So despite that, but having the understanding, whether it's a marriage, relationship, paternity, or domestic partnership, having those discussions and coming to the conclusion of what's right for the
Yeah.
units, for lack of a better word, not one shoe fits all feet. You gotta figure out what fits for that particular
That's true.
couple and go forward.
And that's why even, and again, like not everybody gets a prenup, but there are certain laws so that you are, whether you like them, agree with them or not, that's going to really guide the divorce process as far as your rights and, what you may be entitled to. But, I would say part of what I always say and have said on the show, certainly through guests with prenup postnups, is you are going to be subject to the laws of the state you live in, or you can determine that and say, you know what, we're going to agree if we make these decisions, this is how we'll split up. But in a domestic partnership, and if you are just living with somebody and working together, like you said, as a unit, and having children and investing your time, money, and emotions in that with each other, it's so wise to have an agreement and have some
Absolutely.
rights, because otherwise it is a mess. And really, Rebecca, I don't think there's any cause of action. I mean, they're out of luck in Florida, aren't they? I mean,
Yeah.
unless you have kids, but then there's still not going to be the finance.
No, and even if you have kids, it's still an issue. You're absolutely right, Heather. I think getting a definition of what the relationship looks like is
Mhm.
imperative. And while messy and icky and uncomfortable, it's really, really important.
And it's
Um,
a lot less uncomfortable than after you've invested years and made agreements and then find out, oh my gosh, like if this breaks up, maybe I'm just out on the street and I've got nothing,
right,
yet I poured into this person. We agreed, but without having that contract, and that's when say, oh, you lawyers, complicate everything. It's like, well, in a lot of ways, we give you a lot of solutions and protections that otherwise you wouldn't have had.
right,
And
right.
it is so messy because then there's the emotions and that relationship part, and which makes family law challenging and difficult. But you will still go through all of those emotions, but you have no legal protections from going through a divorce.
Exactly. I mean, I'm vividly remembering a situation I had once of a prenup. And, back in the day, I do not do this anymore. I used to film the signing of it.
Oh, I've heard all about that. That was supposed to be this great way to show how everybody was
Right,
voluntary.
right. No. So this particular case was the opposite. So my client's breaking down crying.
Oh no.
I'm like, oh,
no.
this is defeating the entire purpose, of filming this. We shut down the cameras. We went for a walk. Both were actually pretty wealthy. She worked and he worked. And they both did very well for themselves. But it was emotional. I mean, just having to sit down and going, okay, it's hard to plan your marriage and plan your divorce at the same time,
True,
But-
true.
and
It's a
bring it
challenge.
back to domestic partnership, same concept.
Right.
I don't think it's a good idea to make certain commitments if you don't have understandings of what the dynamic is going to look like, and what
Mhm.
is our unit going to look like.
Mhm.
If you're saving your 401k and I'm not, but I'm doing all the chores or what have you, how's that
I mean,
fit?
and you're using the money like, one of you stocking away in the 401k, the other is like, well, I'm using it for us to travel. So we're having these wonderful experiences together, doing things, but yet who's going to be out of luck,
Exactly, exactly. It's about conversations, as most relationships are, and it's this domestic, partnership, marriage, paternity. these conversations need to be had. Even if
They
they,
do.
even if
And
they
right,
create tears.
exactly. And it's a good, and it's easy for us because we've been doing this a long time. And I've also been married about 22 years. So I didn't have these conversations back then either, but we've learned, right? I've been doing this so long. Now I can say, but that communication is foundation. And if you can't talk about some of this stuff before you get married, like it doesn't really get a whole lot easier. Like it's still a weird conversation, but it's just breaking through and trying to have that, right?
I agreed 100%. These conversations, whatever the design of the relationship is, needs to happen. And then you take it to that next level. If you're getting married, you don't necessarily need a prenup or postnup, although advisable,
Exactly.
if it's applicable. But in a domestic partnership, all the more reason to have these conversations, because there aren't clear definitions of what would happen. And if it's not down in writing, parole evidence rule, it's not going to be used. So you need a contract.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a great conversation. We are going to take another short break and then we'll be right back. And listeners, if this is your favorite part of the week, please subscribe to our podcast as well as leave us a review. That will allow others to find this podcast and hopefully help them as it's helped you. We will be right back. We are back from our last break. And again, today I'm joined by Rebecca Palmer. We've been discussing domestic partnerships and are shifting now to what happens when a couple decides they no longer want to be together. And Rebecca, you and I are both focused heavily on traditional divorce. But when it comes to a domestic partnership, and obviously to have a domestic partnership in anything legally recognized, you've got to have an agreement, right? Now,
True,
and then how does this process look when you guys are breaking up and you have the agreement on, do you need a family law lawyer? Like how does that
Messy.
work?
It's messy because so assuming you have a contract is not as messy.
Okay, right.
Because then you got an agreement, you have a contract and an understanding of what's to occur. There's always interpretation of that contract, etc. Was there any fraud? Was there any pressure? That aside, let's say it's legit contract, you follow the contract. But without that, messy, messy, messy.
And is there even an avenue? And we'll talk about children, which really is attorney because we're not dealing with property, but is there a legal avenue for couples if they have no agreement and share no children?
Not really. It's a he said, I don't even know. Heather, help me think of it. I don't even know what that would be called. It's like, this is going to sound silly, but let's say, you and I are in a domestic partnership and I know we're both married, etc. That's not what our relationship is, but what if it was? What does that look like? If it went south,
I think
there's no definition. There's no law
Right.
guiding you on how to do it. There's no contract telling you what to do. So if anyone out there is at all contemplating the concept of domestic partnership, I highly encourage that you sit down with someone. I'm a big believer that you both should go to somebody different.
I think so.
I'm not a fan of one lawyer sitting down with two people, and that may be frustrating to your listeners because, wait a minute, we don't want to pay two lawyers, but do
It's hard to
get some
advise
opinion.
two people on possibly competing and conflicting rights and ultimate resolutions. I think I agree with you, Rebecca. I do think you each individually need your own attorney so that you really understand, because I think as you need the attorney to say, hey, here is the best, the worst side, what this would look like. Let's compare it to if you got married. Let's come up with something that meets your needs. And you obviously can share with your attorney stuff you don't necessarily have to share with your significant other that helps them maybe draft an agreement with your end goals in mind.
And I highly recommend, if you're not in the legal world like we are, you may see all these free consult, well, guess what? You get what you pay for.
Amen. Thank you, Rebecca.
In the family law. So, if you call some lawyers and they actually have a consult fee and it sounds significant to you, well, that may be a good thing. Maybe
Mhm.
they're going to spend that extra minute to 10, 2 hours with you. My clients leave with a whole notebook with
Mhm.
research, tailored towards their situation so that they don't sit down and get a freebie and I'm not really invested and they're not really invested in the conversation.
Mhm.
So I do your homework, find somebody good, find somebody smart, somebody open-minded, because this domestic partnership, as we said, is so new. And a lot of people you what? You want what?
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
So try to find somebody who thinks out of the box. Look at the website, look at the reviews, ask around. And then, my consults are almost 2 hours, where we sit down and really talk through things. And I think that's the type of thing the listeners should know. Don't just go check the box, talk to somebody, didn't cost me a dime, didn't really learn much. Okay. That's not your homework. Your homework is to sit down, ask the questions, come in with questions, take the guidance and move forward. Because again, I said it jokingly, but you get what you pay for. And you want the lawyer and for you to be invested in the
Absolutely.
conversation.
And okay, I've had, as we've talked through, I remember a couple different cases in the past where they had children together, so we were able to deal with that. But then we have had couples that they bought property together. They still hadn't married, but so then
Right.
they had jointly owned a home, real property. And
Same.
that gets really messy as well because then that had to be in a different court. And so for our listeners, which this is going to seem so convoluted to you, but the reality is the children can be resolved. We can handle that in family law court, but if just merely separating the property because they were not married, had to be a whole new action in civil court just to sell the property,
Absolutely.
which is then twice as expensive. I mean, you have to get totally different lawyers that specialize just in civil,
right.
civil
Civil
litigation.
and real estate lawyers, right. So it's
Yep.
like a whole nother ballgame. So invest early on.
Hmm.
So it'll be easier later on.
And still, it may, I think because, and this is just, you know, um, me considering this because then I know we had another case at one time and they had a contract. It wasn't, a thought out like domestic partnership agreement, but they contracted on some things and yet then had children. And again, we had to have two separate sets of lawyers where because they didn't create an agreement that said we intend to resolve these things within the family court based on this. And I don't know if that would work, Rebecca, if you could specify that, like that your finances would be resolved in the same court if you have children's issues, if you specified that in your agreement, or how would they do that in Orlando? Can you imagine?
I guess it's kind of jurisdiction selection, right?
Mhm.
But my thought process is put it in the contract, just like we say, okay, going to be governed by the state of Florida's laws,
Mhm.
if that's what you want. And having understanding, okay, if this falls apart, where do we go? What applies?
Mhm.
All of that can be in their contract, as you know, and the listener should know. I mean, you think out of the box,
Right.
of what exactly does this look like if it doesn't work out, and who gets the dog, you know,
And that's important. That's very important.
very
People,
important to me. I love my dog,
me
but
too.
it's
Although my
interesting by the
husband
way.
always says you get your dogs, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like,
I'm a parent. I'm apparently going down a rabbit hole, but I just wrote an article on this very topic that it's interesting because again, states are different.
right.
So Florida looks at a dog like property.
Mhm.
If you bought the dog and the dog cost $100 and somebody gets it, well, the other person knows the money. So it's
Right.
like property. There are some states, and I won't quote which ones, but there are some places in some states that it is best interest of the pet.
No
Yeah,
way.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, Rebecca, that is fascinating.
Isn't it?
Oh,
So
that would be worth the price of admission to go watch that trial on the best interest of the animal, just because I would love to see how they
I would handle.
how they would handle it and how they would prove it, right? Oh
Eh,
my
well,
gosh.
here's one idea of how to prove it. So I had a case where the dog became the fight, part of the many fights. And this judge has since retired, but it was the funniest ruling. And he didn't really care what the law was. He made up his own decision on how it was going to be handled. Because this is what I want you guys to do. I want you to go to park with an independent person. That person is going to put the dog in the park. You both go to the other ends. And this is my favorite quote. I don't care if you wrap yourself in bacon, but whoever gets the dog runs to gets the dog. I was like, oh my God, what a ruling, you know?
That
Yeah,
is,
he and I still laugh about that, even though he's retired to this day. I'm like, that was the funniest ruling. I'm like, wasn't really the law, but it was very funny. So
which
yeah,
is a good thing for our listeners. Look, guys, I want you to listen to this for our listeners, because sometimes, because I've had things like that happen too, where you can get a result that really isn't maybe what the strict definition of the law or any interpretation of the law is, because you are dealing with an individual who's making decisions and who's maybe doesn't, well, not maybe, it's impossible for them to feel the same way about your things and your children, your pets that you do, which was, of course, the basis and why we're saying get an agreement in writing, because I mean, that's the result when folks are married. And so there are certain, boundaries and rules with which to abide by. But if you are not going to get married, but yet join and, share your life and finances and create a family with somebody without the legal protections of the law, you need an agreement, whether it's a domestic partnership agreement or a cohabitation agreement. It's some kind of contract that allows the two of you to really spell out what are our obligations to one another going to be, what rights do we both agree we each have. Because then I think you have a good
absolutely.
shot, right, Rebecca? Then you have a chance of getting that enforced.
Yeah,
Because now it's
and some things your listeners may not realize is, let's say they go buy a couch together, and the couch costs $1,000. Guess what? That's not what it's looked at.
Mhm.
And once you've bought it, and you've sat on it, it's not worth $1,000 anymore. Maybe 10 to 20% of its value. Whatever you could go sell at a garage sale for is its value. And
Mhm.
I think that's always a shocker to clients too, when they separate. Is, well, wait a minute, you're getting a house full of furniture. Look at all this furniture. It's not worth what you think it would be. So these again are kind of conversations to have. Are we going to split buying all the furniture? But then who gets it? if,
Right.
if we're both paying for it, and it doesn't work out, what do? It's not War of the Roses. You're not going to cut the couch in half.
Exactly.
How are you going to handle it? So again, another part of the dialogue to be had when you don't have, the guiding laws like in family law, because you have a unique out of the box kind of relationship like a domestic partnership. And so what are our rules going to be? Because we're making them. Let's just make sure we understand them.
Right. And that's the beauty of it. You can make them and agree to it. And then if you have something enforceable, if you go about it in the right manner, because I know everybody likes to believe that, well, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and we'll just walk away and, be happy and fine and cordial. And you and I have both seen too many cases where that's not really quite how
Quite
it
what
works.
happens. Yeah, that's not quite what happens. Even in decent breakups. I
Yes.
mean, you and I both, Heather, had such complicated situations. Let's say they build a business together and
Yes.
have
I love
no
that. Yeah.
employment business agreement. Okay,
Mhm.
then what, guys? Make sure to see a contract lawyer and or corporate lawyer potentially to go through and design what happens if we have to dissolve this business, because expectations could be so far from one another. you know
Yeah.
you just sell a law firm, like, oh my gosh, this law firm makes us money, blah blah blah. Well, guess what? What's your AR? What's your accounts receivable? you know and can you really sell it for what you think it's worth? It may be worth a lot to you as a couple,
Mhm.
but not necessarily if you're having to divide it up. And who's going to come by certain kind of businesses if it's not in goods, but if it's a
Well, and
services.
that's a really good point, Rebecca, because I think that can happen also very often too, is you're romantically involved, and then you get involved in business, and yet they're like, well, no, we're, two adults and we're just gonna manage this and we'll figure it out. But you can really, really end up on the short end of the stick, depending on how things are titled and
Correct.
who has spent what. And, and I think for women too, be sharp, because if you don't think he's not thinking about it, you're crazy. And you don't want to learn on the back end, oh, his name was on everything, but I thought we were doing this all together.
Right.
And then, you're out on the street with nothing and have or if you try to sue, especially if it's like the business and the romantic relationship, it's going to be messy and just very costly. And it could be really risky,
Right,
an
right.
expensive venture that you don't know if you're going to
So
win.
have those icky, awful conversations up front.
Exactly. See how they
While you're in love, have those conversations.
Indeed. Exactly. For sure. Well, this was a bit of a different kind of conversation than we normally have on the show, but I really appreciate you, Rebecca, because I think
Oh, thank you, Heather.
there are so many people out there, and we don't know what we don't know, and they're not thinking that there is maybe even a way for them to protect themselves in these situations. But you really, if you're proactive and you think, you find the right people, your rights can be protected, and hopefully you never need it, but then you sure will rest easier.
And while difficult, it can actually strengthen the relationship.
Absolutely.
Because then you have an understanding of one another. There's no mystery to it. Jumping in blind and not knowing where you're going, so, be informed. And I really appreciate what you're doing with your podcast and informing people. And, I hope to see you and talk to you again.
Well, I appreciate you so much, Rebecca. And before we go, I do have one last question for you. If you can impart on our listeners what you have learned about advocating for and empowering women throughout your career.
Oh my goodness. That's a loaded question.
I know it is. And I should have asked you at the beginning of the show. We might still be answering it, but just your fine words of wisdom.
So be your own self-worth. Do something you love. Don't feel a rush get into a domestic relationship, partnership, or marriage, or what it may be. I had a personal rule of how old I had to be before I would allow myself to get married. That may not be the answer for everybody. It's certainly not for my daughter. But, women, we roar. Hear us roar. And, and we have so many strengths and talents. Don't ever sell yourself short. Don't let anybody walk on you, man or woman. Know that you have value. Know that other women can. Sometimes they stab you in the back, but most of the time we can support each other and progress. And so I really appreciate the opportunity and what you do. And I really tell women out there, dream it, do it, live it. There's so much you can do, and don't let your gender limit you.
That's amazing. I really appreciate you, Rebecca, and thank you so much for being on our show. And as we reach the end of our show, listeners, you can find Rebecca Palmer at Rebecca L. Palmer Law Group in Orlando. And of course, her information and links will be in our show notes. Thank you again.
Heather, thank you so much. You're lovely. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you. And if you or someone you know is going through divorce or thinking about divorce, of course, reach out to us at FloridaWomen'sLawGroup.com or join our Facebook group, Women Winning Divorce. The link will be below in the episode description, and please leave us a 5-star review. And thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Women Winning Divorce. My goal is to elevate your life and the way you are thinking so that you are best equipped to win at life. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe so you automatically get my new shows every week. And I would love to hear from you personally. Come join the conversation on social and join our Facebook group, Women Winning Divorce. We welcome your comments and suggestions. We want to bring you content that helps move your life forward. Women Winning Divorce is the place for an elevated conversation